Hi, my name is Mike Loon and I'm running for Manhattan Borough President. In this video, I'd like to confront one of the more common arguments against new housing, the idea that new housing contributes to overcrowding and even burdens the city's infrastructure or burdens neighborhood infrastructure. So the basic theory is quite simple. Some people, in fact, I saw it on one of the mayoral debates, one of the minor mayoral candidates, the Conservative Party nominee, said something like, I don't remember exactly what it said. It was something like essentially, well, we shouldn't build too much housing or upzone because it might contribute to overcrowding. The problem with that is that overcrowding is actually in part a result of higher housing costs, which of course is caused, as I've pointed out in earlier videos, by zoning that prevents housing from being built. How is that so? Well, first of all, one form of overcrowding is, of course, homelessness. That is to say, if you live in Manhattan, especially as I do, you kind of have to navigate around down and outers sleeping in the street. So that is certainly a form of crowding. And that form of crowding exists partially because of problems of mental illness and addiction, but also partially because of high rents. Because you think about, the 50s and 60s, certainly there were people, alcoholics and drug addicts, but usually they had places to stay. Usually they had what people called flop houses in those days, that now the city is too expensive to support. Another form of crowding that doesn't really involve homelessness is, of course, people having roommates. That is to say, if you're in a cheap city, it's very rare to have roommates. Typically, if you live in, say, Houston, if you have any money at all, you're probably going to be able to afford at least a small apartment of your own. On the other hand, in New York, it's very common for people, even middle-class people with lots of degrees by their names, they often have roommates. So that's certainly a form of overcrowding, when you have two people share or three people sharing an apartment that could easily be used by one person. And of course, this form of overcrowding over the past year and a half has been actually lethal in some places. In fact, Los Angeles is, I think, especially notorious for this kind of overcrowding, with multiple families living in a house that was made for one, or multiple people living in an apartment that was made for one or two people. And so they had a major COVID problem in early 2021 when the worst was over here in New York. So in other words, high housing prices are actually a cause of overcrowding. So what about infrastructure? A related argument to the overcrowding argument is, well, if we allow new housing in my neighborhood, the infrastructure will be overburdened. And the problem with this argument is that it seems almost impossible to rebut at first glance, because there are so many different things you could describe as infrastructure: schools, streets, buses, subways. So even if one of them isn't affected by new residents, another one will be. So let's just say, for example, sidewalks. Obviously, if you have 10 new residents, that's 10 more people on the sidewalk. The problem with that argument is, by that logic, you shouldn't build anything anywhere, right? Because building anything anywhere or having any new people anywhere burdens the infrastructure of that place. So for example, let's say that 100 people are priced out of Manhattan and moved to Brooklyn. So that doesn't eliminate the infrastructure problem. It just means the infrastructure problem, the so-called burden on infrastructure, is exported from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Another problem is when you have homelessness and overcrowding, that too burdens the infrastructure just as much as building the housing does. As to say, not building housing is only partially effective in keeping people away. So as a result, people who are priced out but still stay because they're homeless or because they have roommates are burdening the infrastructure in all kinds of creative ways that they wouldn't if they had normal apartments. So let me give you a couple of examples. Again, imagine a homeless person. So a homeless person who sleeps on the street is obviously burdening the infrastructure of that street in various ways. Even if they're not urinating and defecating on the street, they're still creating a kind of impediment to other people walking on the street, because people have to walk around them. They're creating just as much of a burden on the sidewalk as a new resident or maybe even 5 or 10 new residents walking on that very same sidewalk would. Similarly, if you imagine 3 people living in an apartment that's made for 1, that's obviously going to burden the apartment more in all sorts of little ways. So again, when you have overcrowding caused by high housing costs, that actually burdens the infrastructure more than maybe if we'd had more apartments and lower housing costs. So in other words, for the reasons stated above, I'd like to suggest that basically the overcrowding and infrastructure arguments are to some extent a fraud, and to some extent actually maybe an argument for new housing instead of against new housing. So on that note, see you on the campaign trail.